Let me get this out of the way right off the bat. I'm using text-to-speech for this video because I don't aspire to become YouTube famous and because I already hate my voice enough without the comment section's help. If it bothers you, feel free to mute the video. I'm making this video in response to 2 videos by Midnight. His channel was recommended to me because I've been on a Doom binge lately. I'm sure you've all noticed how YouTube encourages binging a single topic. I replayed Ultima Doom. I watched some videos about it, I stumbled on MyHouse.WAD, I played through that, and now I'm halfway through a Doom 2 replay because I'm nostalgic for it and because it's all my YouTube recommendations are about anymore. I clicked on one of Midnight's videos because it covered a WAD that looked fairly similar to my house, and then I clicked on his channel because I was hoping to find more videos in a similar vein. The reason I bother going into all this background is that I've come to expect a certain kind of pushback from the viewpoints I'm about to criticize, and I want to deal with a few possible misconceptions before I get seriously into things. I didn't find these videos because I was looking for something to be offended by, and I'm not some kind of anti-gamer attacking gaming. While I haven't played Doom Eternal and therefore won't be addressing the question of whether criticism of the game is warranted, I'm squarely in the game's target demographic, at least in the sense that I'm nostalgic for the kind of gameplay it's harkening back to, and I'm squarely in the channel's target demographic, at least in the sense that I enjoy watching videos that discuss Doom in terms of gameplay. As you've probably already guessed, browsing through Midnight's channel quickly led me to a video that caught my eye, called Feminist Reviews Doom Eternal, and it is insanely bad response. This video appears to be a response to another video of his that is, as I write this script, about a year old. The thumbnail, which I'll show now, note to self. This is the part of the video where the thumbnail gets shown, don't forget, depicts the Doomslayer giving the finger to one of those women people use when they want to strawman feminists, along with the words, "Doom is transphobic," in scare quotes. Naturally, I was intrigued. Is there discourse suggesting that Doom is transphobic? Am I accidentally watching one of those cringy nega SJW channels that constantly complains about how everything it doesn't like is woke, whatever that means? Nothing I had heard up to that point had led me to believe either of those things might be the case, and my morbid curiosity immediately got the better of me. Incidentally, if it seems like I'm working backward here, it's because I deliberately am. Midnight's video is a response to Midnight's video response to an article that, as I write this part of the script, I haven't actually read firsthand yet. I'm addressing it this way for 2 reasons. The first is that I experienced the dialogue this way and expect anyone else encountering it for the first time through his channel will most likely experience it the same way, assuming they even bother to dig that far into it rather than just assuming he's right about everything. The second is that, while I do plan to circle back to the original article before I wrap things up here, I'm confident that my criticisms of how Midnight approached this conversation will still hold even if I end up deciding the article is even worse than Midnight presents it as being. I'm linking Midnight's videos and the original article in the description, partly because I really don't want to do the back and forth format that seems in vogue on commentary YouTube. I'm not going to engage with every single thing point by point, I'm just going to engage with the arguments that strike me as relevant to what I wanted to say with this video. Everything will make a lot more sense if you actually watch his videos and have the context of the overall conversation. With that front material out of the way, then, we're finally on to what I'll call Episode 1, knee-deep in Midnight's response to Midnight's response. The first segment is about how the original video was Midnight's most popular video up to that point. I'm hardly surprised, there's a thriving market for that sort of thing on YouTube. I'm disappointed that the lesson he seems to have taken from that is that he should lean into catering to that interest, but we'll get into that. He then says that he received some amount of backlash over the video. Since I'm also criticizing him here, I should mention that I don't know what people have said about it. I don't necessarily agree with anything anyone else has said about it, And I don't think the things he's said make him transphobic, homophobic, or anything he mentions having been accused of. I do think they show that he feels confident dismissing certain arguments without really thinking about them, and I think that's the audience he's attracting with videos like this one, but again, we'll get into that. The next segment, which goes on for a good portion of the video, is about how he doesn't hate feminism, but he hates what feminism has become. This is the part that first started to set off my hot take detector. While we can all agree there are bad approaches to feminism, he spends a long time here acting like all other feminism has been superseded by bad approaches, which is particularly strange because he acknowledges that there are, even now, multiple different approaches to feminism. What's even stranger is that he frames the existence of multiple approaches as a bad thing, as he takes it to mean that feminists don't even understand, let alone agree with each other. This is the part that makes me want to talk directly to my monitor, the part that, perhaps more than anything, convinced me to bother writing up this script. But midnight, I want to say to him through my monitor, if you like feminism but don't like what you think feminism has become, doesn't that suggest that there should be multiple branches of feminism? Doesn't that suggest that you don't want all feminists to agree? Alas, my monitor has no opinions on feminism, and so I was forced to type all of this up in the hopes that someone would watch a critique of a reply to the replier's own video about an article I haven't read yet about sexism in a game I haven't played yet, when I could be doing something productive, like finishing Doom 2. I'm going to skip ahead a bit, because he then spends a bit of time attacking the thing he thinks feminism has become. And I really have no response to that except to say again that feminism hasn't become any one specific thing, it's a variety of things. There are, again, bad approaches, but there are also lazy takes that cherry-pick the worst Twitter posters, paint them as though they were a complete representation of modern feminism, and poison the well so that people don't even bother taking feminist arguments seriously before dismissing them. The past feminism that Midnight calls good is very much still alive. The modern feminism that Midnight demonizes exists largely in the sort of feminist cringe compilations his packaging of the videos invokes, and the article that prompted all this appears far too reasonable to merit this comparison. I'll have to get back to the article, though, as he doesn't actually mention it at all in this video. Instead, most of the rest of the video is about Mary Sue's, which I'm not going to bother going into depth on because it seems to come entirely from a YouTube comment and has very little to do with his original video nor with the article. I do think there's a tendency in a lot of fiction lately to shortcut character development. I think there's a tendency in a lot of consumers of fiction to be hyper-aware of this trend when and only when the main character is a woman and to ascribe it to some kind of woke ideology when the same thing tends to happen in stories about men. He agrees to this latter fact but waves it away by insisting it happened because of woke feminism, and most importantly, I think if you're even the slightest bit interested in an argument about Mary Sue's, nothing Midnight says in his video, nor anything I could say in response, is something you haven't already heard 1,000 times. There are two things he says that I want to just bottle and save for later, though, partly because I think they'll come in handy for the rest of this script and partly because I agree with them. First, when explaining why he doesn't like Mary Sue's, he says it's because they're never given actual challenges. Second, when explaining why it matters, he says the media we consume shape our identity, our beliefs, and the way we view the world. The end of the video is about manga, and I just have no opinion whatsoever as far as that goes, which is fine because I think those two statements we've got bottled up there should still be fresh in our minds as we approach his original video. I'll call this part Episode 2, The Shores of Midnight's original video. Around the 30-second mark, he says this: even though gaming is my passion, I understand that, at the end of the day, all of this is pure fiction. It doesn't exist and should not be compared to reality. I can't help but wonder whether the Midnight in this video is the same one who made that statement about the media we consume. Maybe this Midnight was briefly kidnapped by SJWs who added that comment to his response video, and he forgot to edit it out when he escaped their clutches. We're finally introduced to the article by way of an introduction that name-drops Judith Butler's gender trouble. How, asks Midnight, is there a gender trouble in a game that is focused on killing demons gracefully? I imagine that's something the article might tell us, but his confrontational tone right off the bat suggests he's getting ready to dismiss it out of hand rather than give it a fair hearing. Do I know immediately what the article is getting at? No. Can I imagine gender trouble in a game that, at least on the surface, is about killing demons, gracefully or otherwise? Absolutely. The article asserts that the game shamelessly panders to an older audience. Midnight is dismissive of this claim because he and his channel analytics trend younger than whatever he imagines older to mean here. This is a very odd nit to pick. I'm not surprised that throwback shooters would appeal to younger players. They're a throwback to a time when shooters were action games, coming at a time when the genre is dominated by action movies with short interactive segments. Still, it's a throwback to a game from 1993. And it's part of a trend of boomer shooters inspired by the tastes of people who remember playing games like Doom in 1993. The fact that they aren't the only market for it doesn't mean it's not pandering to them, and the fact that he feels the need to disagree with this banal claim at length only strengthens my suspicion that he's engaging with the article in bad faith from the outset. When the article claims that female action heroes in the 80s and 90s were the exception rather than the rule, he agrees, but he excuses it by saying that men are stronger on average than women. This argument ties into an earlier assertion that games should be realistic, or realistically unrealistic. What I think he misses here is that realistically unrealistic just ends up being a synonym for appealing to a particular fantasy, which seems to be the exact point the article is trying to make. This is the first in a series of moments in the video when he seems to really believe he's explaining something the people he's arguing with in absentia have never considered. But Midnight, couldn't there be something about that fantasy worth investigating? Isn't there a risk posed by selling and consuming fantasies that we refuse to critically examine? After all, a wise man once told me that our media habits shape our identity, our beliefs, and the way we view the world. He seems to act as though the mere act of asking these questions is a condemnation of his lifestyle, his worldview, or something on that level, when nothing in the article thus far has suggested anything except that these are good questions to ask. This all seems unnecessarily defensive. He goes on to say that media products should be marketed to their main demographic and that, for 1990s action movies, that demographic was men. Again, I think he's explaining to the article why he agrees with it but doesn't realize that's what he's doing. What we have from the article so far, 6 minutes into his video, is that Doom Eternal is a throwback to a 1993 game marketed primarily to men. The article has yet to attack anyone or to say anything with which Midnight has any fundamental disagreement. There's a brief aside here about how much he hates Mary Sue's. There was one at the beginning of the video, too. I let it pass without comment because, as with the other video, it's not terribly relevant. I bother to bring it up here just because this is where the attacks on straw feminists really begin to stand out, and this is a pattern that will be more apparent later. The article hasn't said anything about Rey from the Star Wars remakes, nor will it say anything about certain other positions he ascribes to it later. The article says there are no women in the game except for 3 named characters. Midnight responds by showing a clip with 2 female extras in it. While this is technically an error on the part of the article, I think this is another nitpick. As I said, I haven't played Doom Eternal, but I think if there were a 4th woman with actual plot significance, that's probably what Midnight would have shown here, not 2 extras. Shame on the article for being technically incorrect, shame on Midnight for deliberately missing the point. He goes on to say that it's okay there are no other women because this is a story that isn't about them. Well, yes, that's necessarily correct. This story has few women in it because it's a story that has few women in it. His response to the line about imaginary crisis is more of the same. I'm sure Midnight realizes that Doom Eternal isn't a documentary, it's a work of fiction. If ZeniMax's marketing department had determined this story should involve 200 women, it would have found a way to make that work. A wise man once told me it's important to be given actual challenges. When we approach a work of fiction we enjoy as though it's a documentary that could only have been told one way and that the story decisions therefore shouldn't be questioned, we're effectively making an excuse to avoid having our preconceptions challenged. And we're refusing the growth opportunity that comes with examining our relationship with media. It amuses me a little when he says there are no women because it's a single-player game. Isn't male as default kind of the point the article is making? This is a minor point, but I think it's easier for Midnight not to notice because he's not a woman. I remember being a gamer in the 90s. And the message from developers and from the community was overwhelmingly that they preferred to keep the hobby as a boys' club. Midnight, have you read the Doom Bible? The game was originally going to have nudie calendars in it, and given the culture at the time, I'm a little surprised it got cut. It's okay to acknowledge this bias. It doesn't mean we're condemning everyone who makes or plays these games. When the article characterizes Elena Richardson as a cheerleader to the Doom Slayer, Midnight counters that she is instead a representation of the player's own perception of the Doom Slayer. That response, I think, clashes with his repeated characterizations of Doom Eternal as a power fantasy. I don't think you can have it both ways, and I think the power fantasy interpretation is the one of the two that actually holds water. The player isn't meant to imagine being the Doom Slayer's cheerleader, the player is meant to imagine being literally Jesus Christ with a shotgun. The next comment from Midnight is about two pieces of sexualized art apparently featured in the article. This bit is difficult to comment on because it's given no contextualization in the video. I get the impression part of the article is skipped over, but it's common practice to put a caption visual aid in articles, and it often appears at a point that doesn't make much sense in the context of the article, so perhaps it was just as much of a non sequitur from Midnight's perspective as it was from mine. As I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of what isn't official game art, I'm inclined simply to take Midnight's word that these works are fan art. What relevance these works are meant to have to the article is unclear, whether that's because of Midnight's presentation or the article's. The article's presentation, of course, might very well have come down to the decision of an editor rather than the article's author. As long as we're on the topic of fan art, though, I may as well point out that sexualized fan art shows the relationship at least a portion of the audience has with these characters. I say this already knowing that some people will retort that there is also sexualized fan art of male characters, and they make that retort already knowing that sexualized fan art of male characters is a drop in the bucket compared to sexualized fan art of female characters. Again, if you actually care about this argument, you won't hear anything new about it here, and it isn't really important to this particular conversation. So I won't dwell on it. The bit about masculine nudity and male power is similarly difficult to respond to because there seems to be missing context. Midnight attempts to refute this point by bringing up female protagonists from video games, but Doom Eternal isn't Tomb Raider, it's Doom Eternal, and Tomb Raider was consciously responding to a gaming landscape in which men are kings. His response to the masculine nudity bit, however, is where this video really goes off the rails. Even if you showed a female superhero like Doom Guy having the luxury of masculine nudity, you would just say that we're sexualizing that character. But Midnight, how do you know what they would say? This becomes a refrain that he picks up and runs with. He's decided what he thinks they would say if things had gone differently, even though it seems to clash with their later statements about sexualization. And because the things they actually do say don't gel with what he thinks they might have said otherwise, he writes them off as hypocritical. The very next paragraph, in fact, is written off simply because it doesn't make sense coming from the version of the author Midnight has imagined. Midnight next identifies one of his main issues, which of course means this section is particularly important. Why is it such a problem that the Doomslayer is a man? But Midnight, what makes you so sure that, in the eyes of the article, it is such a problem? All the article has done, at least in the segments presented in the video, is identify broader trends associated with the fact that the Doomslayer is a man. Again, it seems so far as though the article has simply examined the fact that the Doomslayer is a man, and you've gotten very defensive about the whole project. To an extent, I think this is back to putting words in the article's mouth, but I think we're more so back to both of our bottled phrases and the body snatcher SJW Midnight, who appears briefly in the response video. Why is it such an affront to examine the media we consume and ask questions about the cultural contexts that gave rise to it and the message it's putting forward? He then challenges critics of Doom to make their own game, which both misses the point and misses the fact that games addressing exactly these biases exist, and some of them are very good games. If you like Doom but want more female representation, why not make Iron Fury? And more importantly, why not make it without ever having any conversations beforehand about why it needs to be made? Conversely, if Midnight doesn't like Rey in the Star Wars remakes, why doesn't he simply stop talking about her forever and make his own movies? Perhaps it's because making your own movie is more difficult and expensive than I make it sound like here. Perhaps it's because he knows Disney would outcompete him in the market, and he'd be hard-pressed to reach the audience he hoped to or just to break even. Perhaps it's because the media we consume are worth talking about. As a wise man once told me, these stories shape our identity, our beliefs, and the way we view the world. That logically can't apply to Star Wars unless it also applies to Doom Eternal. There's very little in the rest of the video I can comment on because it's either repeating arguments I've already addressed or dealing with claims that have clearly been decontextualized. I do, of course, think it's ironic that he's telling the author of the article to touch grass when all he seems to know about them is they wrote this article, and all I know about him is he's made almost 1,000 videos about first-person shooters. I keep coming back to two of Midnight's arguments because, again, they're good ones. We should examine media with a critical eye, and we should hold challenge and personal growth as important. His two videos on this article are ultimately promoting the opposite attitude, though. They don't want to seriously examine what Doom Eternal is saying about gender, they want to reassure people that they're doing the smart thing by dismissing them offhand. Videos like these attract an audience that wants to feel intellectually superior to modern feminists without putting in any of the work involved, so eager to blame Mary Sueism on the wokes that they can't see how the trophies they're handing themselves for wrecking the feminists are actually just participation trophies. I'd like to think Midnight is capable of seeing how he's gone against his own good advice here. All this is not to say that Midnight should necessarily agree with the article. Simply taking the article's claims at face value would be failing the same way but in a different direction. It is to say, though, that he and his audience shouldn't be so quick to write the article off. As I said earlier, I may read the article and come back thinking it's even worse than Midnight made it sound, although I'm still not going to approve of the project of throwing back tired cliches in lieu of actually considering its claims. In fact, I'm going to read it right now. I had to go find it on my own, as Midnight oddly doesn't even link to it in the description of either video, but it wasn't difficult to find. It should be a quick read that I can breeze through in the episode transition to Episode 3, Inferno. Quick note. Midnight's odd insistence on repeating and enunciating words like dude made me concerned that there was deliberate misgendering going on, which is why I used them when referring to the author up to this point, but the author came out as trans months after Midnight's video was made, so I'm going to assume the choice was made simply because the author was presenting as male at the time. The author now uses they, them or she, her, and I don't know which one is better. But I'm going to go with she until I hear otherwise because her name is now Persephone. There's little point commenting here on the sections Midnight presented in their entirety, which seems to include many of the early paragraphs. I should note that the only editor who could be inserting graphics and captions seems to be the author herself, although there was nothing in Midnight's commentary suggesting this article came from a personal blog, and I was assuming the fact that he even came across it suggested it was from some kind of gaming news site. Just above the fan art referenced in Midnight's video, I came across the first thing he left out of his commentary, which follows the paragraph about being a cheerleader. Maybe women don't want that? Indeed. I really think it's a shame this line didn't make it into the video. It sort of answers the question Midnight forgot to ask about what the point of the article is. Thus far, nobody is attacking it for having made the game nor Midnight for enjoying it. The article is just disappointed that women can't be included in the power fantasy. While I'm sure there are women who like it just fine, this line really resonates with me. I can like these games despite feeling disincluded, but I can't shake the feeling of being disincluded. That's part of what made Iron Fury so great for me. It's like Doom but without that nagging feeling that the game is just kind of waiting for me to leave so it can take its nudie calendars back out without worrying it'll get scolded. This is something about being a girl gamer in the 90s I can understand Midnight not getting, but I wish he'd see acknowledging it exists isn't an attack on him. There is, in fact, no context I can see for masculine nudity unless it's in the links. I can't say much except that I don't quite follow what she's trying to say there. I certainly don't get the impression that she'd be upset about female nudity, though. As for the claims about trans people, they're indeed not at all elucidated. In the portion of the article featured in Midnight's video, what the video covers is all but the last two paragraphs of the intro. The review itself is entirely absent from the video. To be fair, there's not a lot of detail given about why it's such a big deal that transgender people are absent from Doom Eternal, but it does give at least some explanation, and it certainly doesn't say, as Midnight's thumbnail puts in its mouth, Doom is transphobic. What it actually says is that Doom Eternal is an appeal to nostalgia, which includes the author's own nostalgia. The review section spells out that the author played Doom in the 90s and is one of the dreadful olds mentioned in the intro. It also spells out that nostalgia for the 90s is inevitably tied up with nostalgia for a time before any kind of acceptance of women in gaming and a time before the author, like many people, was aware of queer or transgender people. There are, as far as I know, no explicitly transgender characters in Doom, but considering it's a video game franchise dating back to 1993, that's probably a win for transgender people. Considering the fact that the site's main page is headlined by the author's coming out post, it's no surprise that she's hyper-aware of the lack of representation. That's really all it has to say on the subject, though. Not that Doom is transphobic. Not that playing the game makes you transphobic nor sexist nor bad nor old. If you actually read the article and shelve your preconceived notions of what you think someone like the author might say, there's nothing worth getting worked up about here. It's just an exploration of the basic truism that there are drawbacks to nostalgia, written from the perspective of someone with reasons to notice particular aspects of those drawbacks. You might disagree, and you're not necessarily wrong to do so, but disagreeing doesn't make you smarter than her. And disagreeing without actually thinking about what she has to say especially doesn't. The exasperation and smugness in the video are completely out of whack with what the article is putting forward. The idea that the author has never considered the arguments the video is putting forward is absurd. If this article is representative of modern feminism, then it doesn't sound like you've actually given modern feminism a chance, and you're not obligated to. But making more weird WAD videos would be a better use of your time than roasting some random stranger's personal blog post that you didn't even read. Midnight's final score, then, is as follows: items, 25%. Secrets, 10%. SJW feminists wrecked, 0%. Par for getting through 4 paragraphs, 2 pictures, and a handful of short YouTube comments, 5 minutes. Time, 27 minutes, 39 seconds. I don't expect you to be Looper, but I know you can do better, and I hope you take this to heart in the constructive spirit in which it was intended. Making a certain portion of your audience feel good about dismissing other viewpoints may be easy, and I'm sure it's supercharging your revenue, but to win the game, you must seriously confront questions that hurt you plenty, and you have to be open to the possibility of smashing your preconceptions into small piles of putrid debris. To continue the Doom video experience, watch the response consumed.